Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC-TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.
Hi, and welcome to In the Garden. I'm Bryce Lane, and folks, today's show is all about pruning. I'm up here on the ladder pruning this shrub back. Today we're going to talk about when is the best time to prune, what tools are the best tools to use for pruning, but first we need to talk about what pruning is and why we do it. Well, now when we talk about pruning, where do we start? Well, let's start with a definition of pruning. Most horticultural references define pruning as plant part removal. Now you think, okay, I understand, you go and you take some pruners and you cut a tree or a shrub, plant part removal, that's pruning. But there are a number of other examples of pruning that would be exactly the same thing. For instance, when you harvest your vegetables and your fruit, or say you go and you cut basil to bring inside to cook with, that's pruning. Or how about when you cut perennials down in the wintertime? Same thing, that's pruning. Or if you cut flowers to put in a vase to bring inside, that's also pruning. Size control is pruning, as well as deadheading flowers that have already bloomed. All those are examples of plant part removal. So you want to think about that as we approach this topic of pruning. Now, before we ever take our pruners and take them to a plant, the first thing we need to ask is, why am I pruning? When most people are asked, why do you prune your trees and shrub? They respond, because that's what you're supposed to do. Well, think about it. That's what you're supposed to do? Folks, you've got to have a good reason to prune your trees and shrubs. So what I'd like to do is show you examples of some good reasons for pruning. Take this shrub right here. The first good reason for pruning is size control. We home gardeners have a tendency, myself included, to overplant an area. We'll often put plants in so that they get crowded as they grow. Well, that's because when we plant them, they tend to be small and we want that area to fill up. Now these little false cypress, believe it or not, I've got two here, are planted and they've grown out. Now they're much too close to the house. I'm going to have to prune for size control so that I can get good air movement in the house so the siding doesn't get wet and rot. So notice how it's also crowding this dwarf Alberta spruce here in the back. So folks, one of the first reasons you prune is for size control. Just go in there and begin pruning, and of course later on in today's show we'll actually talk about proper technique with the proper tools. But over time you'll be able to prune this back for size control. Number one reason, size control. Now the second reason for pruning is to remove unwanted growth. Remove growth that is not wanted. You say, well, what's unwanted growth? When we talk about pruning, we talk about the 4 Ds of pruning. These are 4 words that start with the letter D that describe unwanted growth. Dead, diseased, damaged, and deranged growth. Now, take this weeping redbud right here. If we were going to apply the 4 Ds to this weeping redbud, the first D that I see is deranged. Folks, look at this. This weeping redbud has a branch that has grown way out and is inconsistent with the habit of that plant, as is this one right here. So what I'm going to do is remove the deranged branches. I'm going to cut right here and get rid of that one. And you can see by removing that branch that I'm kind of maintaining the natural habit of the plant. I've got rid of that deranged branch. And then this one here also needs to be taken away. So I'm going to come in here and cut and remove that deranged branch. Now, if you take a look at the entire plant, you can see that it maintains its natural habit just by making 2 pruning cuts. The other thing you want to consider is the other D that's very important to look at is dead growth, any growth that has died over the year. And take a look at this jasmine right here. Boy, this fall we've had an incredible drought here in Raleigh, and you can see how the drought has affected some of the growth of that particular plant. So, in this case, you want to remove that dead growth. go in and take it out. And I'm just going to begin because this looks like it's going to be quite a project, but you're going to have to go in and remove those dead branches. You also want to evaluate the plant for any disease lesions that you might see. It's always good to remove the diseased branches and anything that might be damaged. Sometimes you'll get a branch that'll break in a storm and you want to remove that damaged branch as well. So folks, don't forget, you've got to remove the 4Ds. If you remove the 4Ds before you do the size control, you're not going to have to do a whole lot of size control. Plus, there are a couple other good logical reasons for pruning that we're going to take a look at. Well, now another good reason for pruning is to remove potential hazards. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, folks, what if you've got a tree or a shrub that has thorny branches or sharp branches? This could pose a real hazard if this plant, for instance, is planted near a walkway or a patio and has branches that are down in the way of people walking by. It could be very dangerous. So here's a great reason to prune. To limb up those branches, come in with your pruners and limb it up. And this is the ultimate in thorny plants. This is called Flying Dragon Poncirus, or hardy orange. It's got little yellow oranges on it that aren't edible though, but just a contorted branch with lots of thorns. Here's a plant you want to put in a place where people can look at it, but not walk by it. Now, another good reason to prune is to remove potential problems. And here's a perfect example of a potential problem. Folks, where you have one branch meeting another, that's called a crotch. And the angle created by that union is called the crotch angle. Well, narrow crotch angles actually pose a weakness in a tree. And when these branches are quite young, if you see a narrow angle, it's probably best to prune it out. Because the wider the angle, the stronger the union. After a thunderstorm or a heavy wind, this branch could break out as this tree gets older. Another reason to prune would be to redirect growth or to shape in unnatural forms. Folks, don't forget, you've got to think about why you're pruning before you start. Now, one of the most important aspects of pruning are the tools that you use. And folks, to do a good job pruning, you've got to have the right tools. So let's talk about pruning tools. The most basic pruning tool that you all need to do lots of pruning is the hand pruner. Now you'll notice here I've got a holster for my hand pruners, and there's the hand pruner. Now the hand pruner is a very unique tool. Holds in your hand and it's got a blade. There are a couple of different types of hand pruners that you want to look at. This is what we call the scissor type, and it cuts like a scissor. If you look here real carefully, you can see the top blade is the cutting blade, the bottom blade is the cradle blade, and when you cut, that top blade literally scissors past the cradle blade. Now that's one type of hand pruner. I'm going to hold this one on my hand. I'm going to pull out the other type. Now this other type of hand pruner is called an anvil pruner. And in this case, the way this pruner works is the top is the blade and the bottom is a flat anvil. In fact, you can see that flat aspect there. There's no cutting at all. There's no cradling. I have an opinion as to which one is a better hand pruner. If you were to cut with the anvil pruner and you were trying to cut up against the stem, the problem with the anvil pruner is you can only get as close as that anvil part will allow, and so it leaves a little bit of a stub. However, with the other type, with the scissor type of pruner, you can see you can actually go up there and cut more off and get closer to the trunk. Now on small branches, that's advantageous. The nice thing about the hand pruners, the scissor type, is that you can cradle and cut. Cradle and cut and make good, clean cuts with the hand pruner. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, that's great. I'm going to go out and get myself a good pair of hand pruners, but what about a bigger branch? What happens if we wanted to cut this branch? What's the size limitation on the hand pruners? Well, folks, there really is no size limitation. You can get that in there and try to cut. The only problem is there's a strength limitation. This is impractical. To get this, to try to prune this, you'd have to use both hands and you'd have to do what I call the pruning dance and wiggle it back and forth. And what ultimately ends up happening is this pruning blade can get out of alignment because we've tried to cut a branch that's too big. So if we don't want to ruin our hand pruners, put them away when you have larger branches and go for the next lineup, and that's called the lopper. And this is an example of a lopper right here. Now a lopper is basically a scissor type pruner. You can see the blade there, okay, on the end of two long poles. This gives you leverage. It's a bigger cutting blade, but it also gives you leverage. So as you can see, you can come in here and you can you can, well, let me go ahead and get rid of that there. There we go. You can come in here with a lopping shear, and with that leverage, you can cut that branch. Nice clean cut with the lopping shear. The other nice thing about the lopping shear is it gives you height. Now you can prune up above your head without having to get on a ladder, and that's always helpful. And you can prune branches, even small ones, with the lopping shears, and it works out pretty well. Of course, the next question is, all right, well, how big a branch can you cut with a lopping shear? Same principles with the hand pruners. If you've got to put that in there and do the pruning dance, wiggle and whatnot, then folks, you need a bigger pruner and not a lopping shear anymore, not a scissor type of pruner. You go to the next level, and that's the pruning saw. Now the pruning saw, here's one here. It comes in a little holster, as you can see here. The pruning saw is very unique. It's not like your typical construction saws. The pruning saw prunes or cuts on the pull stroke, not the push stroke. And that keeps your center of gravity closer to you, especially if you're up on a ladder. And you notice it has this little curl here to hold the back side of your hand. So when you go to prune with the pruning saw, you prune toward your body, toward your body. And let's see if I can find a branch to prune, even if it's small. We'll go ahead and we'll prune this branch right here. You watch me now. I'm going to pull toward my body, toward, and it pulls right off. So you see, the pruning saw is a very handy tool to have. And you know, folks, a lot of people don't have the pruning saw in their repertoire of pruners. And they end up trying to force cutting branches with the lopping shears and make some really, really ugly cuts. Pruning saw is great, and there are lots of them out on the market. Here's one that's like a jackknife. You come in, you press, it opens up. Nice small saw, cuts on the pull stroke. So remember, cuts on the pull stroke, and that gives you that better center of gravity. Hand pruners, lopping shears, goes to the pruning saw. Now with that, you can do just about all the pruning that you need to do, and later on in the show we'll talk about the specific types of pruning cuts. The last thing I got to show you, though, is the kind of pruning tool that everybody wants to use, and it's not really a pruning tool. That's the shears, okay, the hedge trimmers. This is a non-selective type of pruning. It's not selective. You're not making any choice. Look what happens when you prune. It just prunes and cuts whatever's in its path. Now, there's a place for this when it comes to pruning formal hedges and things like that. But folks, when you do selective pruning, you never want to use the hedge trimmers. You never want to use these shears because it's difficult to make selection about where you locate those pruning cuts. So remember, choose your pruning tools wisely, pay a little bit extra money, get good quality tools, and your pruning jobs will come out really well. The most frequently asked question I get about pruning is, when is the best time to prune? And folks, that's a real important question. But here's what the latest research says about pruning and damage on plants. You can't hurt a plant by pruning it, and frankly, you can rarely damage tissue when you prune. In fact, the only time you can damage tissue is when the wood itself of a particular plant is frozen. And that would only be in climates where it's extremely cold. So we really don't have to worry about damaging plants here in North Carolina by pruning them. However, there are better times to prune plants than others. Okay, take for instance the early spring flowering plants. Plants like azaleas, rhododendron, Japanese andromeda, and even these magnolias. This is Magnolia stellata, star magnolia. Now we need to understand how these plants grow from spring through summer. The first thing that spring flowering plants do is flower. That's the very first thing that happens. The flowers open. After that plant is finished flowering, then it flushes. Now that's a technical term that we use to describe when plants put on stems and leaves. That's the vegetative growth, and we call that a growth flush. Well, after the plant is finished flushing, it then sets buds for the next flowering period. Now most of these early spring flowering plants are setting their buds in August and early September, late summer, early fall. So think about it. If you've got an inclination to prune a spring flowering plant in the early spring, you can do that for all those good reasons. The only problem is, look what happens. You get your pruners out, you come up, it's early spring, you go ahead and prune. Well, look what you've pruned off. You've pruned off 1, 2, 3, or 4 flower buds that were just getting ready to open. So it's not logical to prune your spring flowering plants in the early spring because you prune off flowers. So when would be the logical time? The logical time would be to go ahead and prune these early spring flowering plants right after they finish flowering, before they flush. You prune them according to your desires, the plant flushes, it sets buds, and then the following year it's ready to flower. So there's a perfect example of how you need to consider the way the plant grows and the time of year that it flowers in order to know when the best time to prune really is. Well, now let's talk about plants that are summer flowering. You know, things like crepe myrtle and hibiscus. These are plants that start flowering in midsummer and may flower all the way into September. Now, when's the best time to prune them and not prune out flowers? Well, let's look at the way they grow. The first thing a summer flowering plant does in the early spring is it flushes first, and then after flushing, it sets buds. That's right, you see, summer flowering plants set their buds for this year on this year's wood. So we have flushing, setting buds, and then after they set buds, they flower. So if we think about this, flush, set buds, flower, when's the best time to prune this? You might say, well, if you follow the same principle as with the spring flowering plants, they should be pruned right after flowering. Well, that would translate into a fall pruning. The only problem with the fall pruning is that sometimes that'll stimulate growth that is killed by winter, or you might be pruning off growth that winter will kill. So what you want to do is make sure that you prune this right before flushing. Well, when's that? Early spring. Folks, summer flowering plants get pruned in the early spring. A good thing to remember, and it sounds a little bit funny, but a good thing to remember relative to spring and summer flowering plants is always prune before flushing. So when's the best time to prune plants that don't have flowers that we care about? Things like evergreens. This is an arborvitae. It does produce flowers, but we never really see them or even care to look at them. Boxwood hedges or Japanese hollies. When's the best time to prune those things that we really grow for their foliage? Well, folks, in that we don't have to worry about when the flowers appear, it seems that the best time to prune it is really up to you. I like to prune these in early spring, right before the plants flush, because these plants are going to go ahead and flush in early to mid-spring, sometimes later, but you could go ahead and prune in early spring, and remember, for every pruning cut you make, that's going to stimulate a growth response. So you can go in and take care of pruning that particular evergreen or that particular shrub, and then it's going to grow according to the way you pruned it. Now, some people like to prune these plants after they've flushed, when they can see what kind of growth came out, and then they go and do touch-up pruning. Folks, the choice is really yours, because remember, there's no damage that you can do, and you don't have to worry about flowers and cutting them off. Well, now it's time to talk about how to prune. Folks, we need to identify specific pruning techniques that are correct and that will help us achieve our goals when it comes to pruning. Well, the first pruning technique I'd like to talk with you about is called pinching. And in this case, you don't even use a pair of pruners or any tool at all. The only tool you use for pinching, your thumb and your forefinger. And we use pinching on plants that are herbaceous. Herbaceous perennials at times, but mostly we'll pinch annuals. Now, the whole goal of pinching is to help get the plant to branch out and flower more. Now, here's an annual. It's called Kufia, that's got some branches that are growing up, and you might want to get it to bush out, because remember, for every pruning cut you make, you stimulate a growth response. The type of pruning cut you make will influence the kind of growth response you get. So let me go ahead and demonstrate pinching. The goal of pinching is to get some of the straggly branches that are up a little bit higher than the others and get them to go back. Now, you could use a pair of pruners, but you don't necessarily need to use pruners. You can use your thumb and forefinger. And you always want to pinch above where leaves come out. Let me demonstrate. You can see here's a straggler right here. I'm going to come in, thumb and forefinger, pinch it out. There you go. And you can just go through quite quickly and just do some pinching to help shape that plant and to stimulate more growth from the inside to make some more flowers. So remember, the first type of pruning doesn't really require a tool. It's just pinching. It's a lot of fun. You can go out, keep the little pinchings in your hand. Sometimes, depending on the plant, you can even propagate these, but it's a great way to prune herbaceous plants. Now let's go ahead and talk about pruning woody plants. Now folks, there are three basic cuts that we can use when we're pruning woody plants like this shrub here. The first cut is called heading back. And the whole principle of pruning using the heading back cut is to cut back to a bud. All right? So if we were to look at this stem right here, you see there are a number of leaves coming out, each representing where a bud comes out. Well, heading back cut, you cut back to what's called an outward-facing bud. a bud where it's going to sprout and the stem is going to grow outward away from the center of the shrub. If you cut just above there, that's what you want to do, and I'll demonstrate that. If you cut to an inward-facing bud, then you're going to get growth that goes in toward the center of the shrub, and that just becomes a deranged branch that you're going to have to remove later. So let's go ahead and make some heading back cuts. I've identified this bud right here. I'm going to come in with my pruners and I'm going to cut just above that bud, like so. We use the heading back cut for size control. I've identified another bud right here. I'm going to cut right there. And then the last one, here's an outward-facing bud right there. I'm going to come in and I'm going to cut right there. So folks, there you see I've just made 3 heading back cuts. I've managed to diminish the size of this particular plant, and then remember, for every pruning cut you make, there's a growth response. This bud will break and the stem will come out this way, this one will break and the stem will come out this way, and this one will break and the stem will come out that way. So it'll help build the architecture of that particular plant. Well, now the next type of pruning cut is called thinning out. And the thinning out pruning cut should be done on multi-stem deciduous shrubs, like this one that you see right here. And the whole idea behind thinning out is that you prune branches, and generally you're pruning the largest, oldest branches back to ground level. In fact, folks, if you take a look here, you can see last year I went ahead and did some thinning out cuts. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, a bunch more up here. I cut a lot of the larger branches out of this particular shrub all the way back to the ground. Now that seems a little bit drastic, but look at the growth response that you get. You get younger, healthier stems coming from those cuts and coming from the base of the plant to give you a smaller and yet a better architecture for that particular shrub. And so that's basically the reason you do the thinning out, is to get rid of some of those big old burly branches and to cultivate new, younger, healthy branches that flower and fruit just as you'd want them to. Now, if you look through on some of these, you can see this one right here is a little bit large. So just to demonstrate, I'll go ahead and I'll cut that one off. Right here at ground level with the pair of pruners, you go ahead and you cut it, and it removes the entire branch. And so what will happen now that I made that pruning cut is next spring, you'll get growth that'll come from there or just below the base, and out it'll come. Folks, that's the thinning out pruning cut. You only use it on deciduous shrubs, and you always cut the branches right back to the ground. Well, the last type of pruning is called drop crotching. And folks, this may be the most important pruning for woody plants because this is what you do most. Now, the basic principle of drop crotching is very simple. Cut a branch back to where it meets another branch. And of course, you remember that's called the crotch. We're going to take our pruners, we're going to follow that branch back to where it meets the other branch, and we're going to cut. Drop crotching. Let me demonstrate it again. Cut this one back to where it meets another branch. In fact, when you look at it, you can't even tell whether it was pruned. This should be done more than heading back because you won't change the natural shape of the plant, but you can still control size. Don't believe me? Take a look at this. We're going to go ahead and drop crotch this whole branch back to here. Now that seems somewhat drastic, but what's going to happen is other branches are going to grow out from there, and it'll work out just perfectly. So when you do your pruning for size control, removing the 4Ds, always start with drop crotching, and then you can just touch up with heading back. So there are your 3 types of pruning woody plants and pinching for herbaceous plants. Well, our plant of the week this week is Caryopteris divaricata snow fairy, the blue Miss Caryopteris. And it was suggested to us by Christian McCallan of Raleigh, North Carolina. Christian will be sending you an In the Garden t-shirt. And folks, remember, keep sending in those suggestions to the website for a plant of the week. And if we use it on the air, we'll send you an In the Garden t-shirt as well. Well, now let's get back to the blue Miss Caryopteris. Some of you may be familiar with the genus Caryopteris, a low-growing, summer-flowering plant with small blue flowers. But this is a relatively new Caryopteris that comes to us from the Himalayas. Now, this particular plant is a herbaceous perennial, partially woody plant, depending on where in North Carolina you live. Here in Raleigh, this behaves just like a perennial. dies all the way back to the ground, very hardy, and it comes back. You can see it grows about 3 to 3.5 feet tall, and that's one of the unique things. It tends to be a bigger Caryopteris. Not only that, if you look at the leaves, they have a variegated leaf margin. It's a unique coloration of green and white kind of modeled on the leaf. And in the fall, late August all the way through September, it produces little tiny blue flowers. Now what's so great about this plant, it can be used in a shrub border, a perennial border, in a mixed area. You can use it as an accent plant, but it's dependable and it's very drought tolerant. And folks, this fall with the drought that we've had, this plant has thrived. It hasn't shown any signs of problems in the landscape. All you've got to remember to do during February, early March, to go ahead and just cut the dead branches back to the ground. And then later on in the spring, those new shoots will come shooting right up and you'll get a plant this size by the middle of the summer. It's a great addition to the home landscape, and it's our plant of the week, Caryopteris divaricata snow fairy, the blue mist Caryopteris. Well, folks, that's about all the time we've got this week. So until next time, I'll be looking for you in the garden.
To register for In the Garden, the course, call NC State's Distance Education Program at 1-866-GO-STATE. That's 1-866-467-8283. Or log on to distance.ncsu.edu. For more information about the program or to suggest a plant of the week, go to unctv.org/inthegarden.
Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC TV members and by academic programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.